Hello, everyone. Welcome. Welcome to this lecture. This is sponsored by the Tech Catholic community as well as the Catherine McLaughlin Hakeem Fund. And it is my honor to introduce Brother Guy Consolmagno. He is the director of the Vatican Observatory as well as the president of the Vatican Observatory Foundation. He's originally from Detroit, Michigan, which I love as a fellow Michigander. He got both his bachelor's and master's in earth and planetary sciences from MIT, followed by his PhD in planetary sciences from the University of Arizona. He followed that up with a postdoc in research and teaching at Harvard and at MIT. He then served in the Peace Corps for a couple of years before starting as an assistant professor of physics at Lafayette College. He then entered the Society of Jesus and took his vows as a Jesuit brother 2 years later. He studied philosophy and theology at Loyola in Chicago and physics at the University of Chicago before he was ordered to the Vatican Observatory in 1993. His research explores the connections between meteorites and asteroids and the origin and evolution of small bodies in the solar system. He served on the governing boards of the Meteorological Society and was Meteoritical, thank you, Society.
Meteorites, not the weather.
Yes, thank you. Meteoritical Society and was the chair of the American Astronomical Society Division for Planetary Sciences. He's the author of numerous peer-reviewed scientific publications as well as books, including Would You Baptize an Extraterrestrial? He's a well-known public speaker and science communicator and has appeared on the Colbert Report. In 2015, Pope Francis named him director of the Vatican Observatory. He is also the curator of the Vatican Meteorite Collection.
Not anymore.
Thank you.
Brother Bob, who is also an MIT grad, has taken that over.
Thank you. In 2014, he received an honorary doctorate from Georgetown. He was also awarded the Carl Sagan Medal for his work in communication to the general public about science, and he received the St. Albert Award from the Society of Catholic Scientists last year. And my favorite fun fact is he has an asteroid named after him. So without further ado, welcome Brother Guy.
Thank you. Thanks a whole lot. The topic, why science needs faith, is one of those great things that is designed to provoke. From Galileo to Laudato Si is a little bit closer to where I actually want to go, because I actually started as a history major at Boston College. And my best friend from high school was coming here. When I visited him on the weekend, I discovered that MIT had the world's largest collection of science fiction. So I transferred. And was eventually Skinner of the Mitzvahs for one semester, if anybody knows, anybody here from the Mitzvahs? All right. Long time ago. Yeah, that's what I looked like. It was the 70s. What can I say? And that was me finally at my graduation. The point is that history is a wonderful way to get a grasp on where we've come from, where we are. If you're going to be doing any kind of popularization of science, people love to hear stories about people. So tell stories about people who are doing science, and in the process, maybe they'll actually stick around long enough to hear about the science. What I want to start with, because it's a theme that I'm building the story around, are three fundamental shifts that occurred in the way we understand the universe from the pre-scientific to the scientific world. The Golden Age mentality, the role of instruments in discovery, the standard of proof. And being a good scientist, I'll tell you right now, this triduum is something that I stole from a good friend of mine, Paul Gabor. Nothing is original, but I say, a real sign of talent is knowing who to steal from. So I only steal from the best. What do I mean by these three ways of looking at things? I live in Rome. If you wander around Rome now, you can see the ruins of 2,000 plus years ago on the streets of Rome, just in front of you. Imagine if it was the year 1400, and there's about 10,000 people, if that, living in Rome, and they're surrounded by these ruins. What they are going to realize is that the people in the past could do things that we can't do anymore. But then my grandma always told me how much better things were in the old days. And trust me, the music 50 years ago was so much better than the stuff you guys listen to now. And MIT back then was well, you get the idea. The idea that the universe had a golden age and that everything is slowly running downhill was the common idea through the Middle Ages. Even the Renaissance was merely an effort to try to recapture that golden age into something you might be able to call a Silver Age. That's what the story of Adam and Eve in the garden is all about. It's repeating a common story. That's what the story of Atlantis is all about. That's why people were so respectful of books, because books had knowledge from the past. And even if you don't understand the books, even if the books are saying things that you know in front of your nose aren't true, your assumption is they must have known something, because they come from the past when things were better. The old idea is that knowledge gradually faded over the centuries amidst the general deterioration of things. But with the scientific revolution, suddenly scientists are discovering things that aren't in books. And this shifts to a completely different idea that people in the past were a bunch of ignorant savages, that civilization is accumulating knowledge slowly and painstakingly, and it's all due to science, and science is going to lead us to a world of perfection. And not only that, but if you could see anything good in the past, it was probably due to ancient astronauts. Because heaven forbid, people might have been smart in the past. Now, again, anybody who's lived in Rome and seen ancient Roman architecture compared to modern architecture, or ancient art compared to modern art, you suddenly realize maybe the ancients kind of knew what they were doing. But the common phrase that comes over and over and over again is this word evolution, which doesn't just mean one thing turning into another, but one thing turning into another that's better, always better, forever better. Technology is always going to be better, leading to a better world. Never mind that the Nazis had really, really technologically sophisticated death camps. We're talking Whiggism, a 19th century idea. Along with this change was a change in understanding how the universe behaved. The most complicated things that people in the Middle Ages knew about were organisms. The universe was considered to be an organism. Let me give you an example. Every morning, you get up, you take in the newspaper in the front door, and there's a cat there. After a while, you start leaving a dish of milk for the cat. Every day, there's the cat. One day, the cat doesn't show up, and you go, well, cats are like that. But if the universe is made of rigid rules, a successful way of understanding the universe is one that's repeatable. And if the cat doesn't show up, you want to know why. There must be a reason. It can't just be that cats are like that. And this attitude is maintained in our culture even after the quantum revolution, where, okay, things are unpredictable, but they're predictably unpredictable. Philosophy and mathematics use reason to start with reasonable axioms to derive conclusions that were demonstrated or proved. And there is this chain of causality. Even as our understanding of the laws of physics grows, and as the precision of our data increases, we just change the story of causality, but we never abandon it. And even those of you who have then, studied the world at the quantum level are still really uncomfortable about letting go of causality. The other thing that happens is new data coming from machinery. And Galileo was the perfect example. We'll get back to that. Galileo was the first person who observed the universe through a machine that other people didn't have access to. So how do you know he's seeing things and not just imagining them? How do you know what he's seeing is not just a figment or an error in the device? It turns out some of his more important discoveries were artifacts of the machinery he was using, and he didn't realize that. But the real place I want to start with Galileo is as a media star. I put up Carl Sagan there. He was the guy, when I was a student, that everybody looked to. He was the pop scientist. Today it might be Neil deGrasse Tyson. When I was a kid, it was George Gamow. One thing I discovered was that, when I was at MIT, and my thesis advisor, John Lewis, was always making fun of Carl Sagan, because Carl Sagan was on TV all the time. The next generation of people who went into the field because they saw Carl Sagan on TV all the time. People today love to rag on Neil deGrasse Tyson. I can do that as well as anyone. My best friend knew Neil in high school. We can, I remember when. But he's also attracting a new generation of young scientists. George Gamow, I thought at least he must be respected. He was one of the guys who invented nucleosynthesis. No. When he was around, the scientists of his generation ragged on him for being a pop scientist. Likewise, the other guy there is Brian Cox, I think. He's the sort of the British version of Neil deGrasse Tyson. And he showed up at the Vatican Observatory, and everybody said, "Is that his real hair?" Come on. You want hair, you saw me back in 1972. Talking about Galileo, I'm going to rely a bit on this wonderful biography, which I recommend. I don't agree with everything he says, but I think he really does a great job of bringing forth who Galileo was as a human being. But something he didn't do, that I'll do, is to try to put Galileo into an interesting context. Here are some key dates in the whole Galileo affair. The Copernicus book is published in 1543. Galileo is born in 1564. The Copernicus book gets into trouble as Galileo is in his Middle Ages. I don't know, is there anybody here who was born in 1964? Or knows somebody who was born in 1964 among the older people here? Yeah. Think of that person. We're going from, go back 400 years. Galileo was born in 1964. He's interested in a theory that dates from World War II. But it's now 2020, more or less, and Galileo has written some books that are making this theory popular, but the theory dates back to World War II, and it's not going to be until 2033 that Galileo actually gets in trouble over this book and has a trial about it. And after that trial, he then is going to go on and write another book. Galileo was educated at home until he was 11. He grew up in Pisa, then the family moves to Florence, went to a monastery, briefly was a novice. He learned not only astronomy, but arts, astrology, mathematics, rhetoric, cosmology. By 1578, he's back in Pisa and tries to get into college, but he's too young. He's still a kid. He finally joins the University of Pisa to study medicine. If you wanted to study medicine, you had to know astrology, because a person's astrological sign would tell you what planet he was under the influence of, and therefore explain the disease that we refer to as influence, or in Italian, influenza. Where do you think the word comes from? He has a number of outrageous teachers who reject the going theories. They reject Aquinas because they want to go all the way back to Aristotle, or they reject Aristotle because it's not, they're far right, they're far left. It doesn't matter. They want to make a name for themselves by being different from everybody else. At one point, a mathematician shows up, gives a course on Euclid. Galileo says, "This is what I want." In those days, mathematics was not considered a philosophy. It was mere number counting. But Galileo loves it. And he leaves college in 1585 without a degree. So, think of the Golden Age mentality. Galileo is going to discover new things, knowledge that's not in any book. Think of the role of instruments. Galileo is going to devise a telescope and use the telescope to see these new things. Think about the standard of proof. There's the hitch. Start with the telescope. We actually have copies of Galileo's telescope. The lens is maybe an inch or so across, and it's stopped down because what made Galileo's telescopes better than anybody else's? Maybe the fact that he was in Venice, where they have the best glass in the world. And he could get glass that was uniform and didn't have bubbles in it. And he would make dozens and dozens of lenses to get some that were good enough. Most of them, of course, are going to be spherical, not actual, the proper lens shape that we know of now. Nobody knew how to make lenses. He's making them on his own. He's putting them in these long tubes. Anybody here who's handled a telescope knows how hard it is to find things with a telescope. There's no finder in these guys. And especially the longer the tube, the longer the focal length, the higher the magnification, which sounds good, but it means the smaller the field of view. So using these telescopes was a real tough thing to do. But that wasn't Galileo's genius. He wasn't the only person to look through the telescope. He wasn't the only person to stare at the sky. But Thomas Harriot on the right, the first known drawing of the moon as looked at through a telescope, Galileo's drawings on the left. What's the difference? Galileo had studied art as well as science. He knew perspective. He knew how to interpret what he was seeing. He knew how to portray it in 3 dimensions. What else was a big difference? Galileo had learned writing. He used to argue about who was the better Italian writer, Ariosto or Dante. He learned how to write, and therefore he learned how to express to other people the things that he discovered. Galileo's genius wasn't that he invented the telescope. It's that he knew how to interpret what he saw and how to express his interpretations in a way that people could understand. I could go on for hours about Galileo, one of my favorite characters. Basically, the thing that to get across right now is probably everything you know about Galileo is wrong, but the truth doesn't make the church look any better. 3 things to remember about Galileo. 1, he was a Catholic. He was an Italian. He was a devout Catholic. Okay, he was reported to the Inquisition. You know who was the first person to complain to the Inquisition about Galileo? His mom, because she didn't like his girlfriend. Galileo was a devout Catholic. His 2 daughters both became nuns. Never mind that he never married the mom because he was an Italian Catholic, but that's a different sort of thing. Galileo was never convicted of heresy. At the end of the trial, and you can read the trial in translation, there is no discussion about science and religion issues. It's all on technicalities. And at the end, the trial says, so we're about to vote to find you guilty of heresy because we decided that was what this trial was going to be about. And Galileo says, you never showed that I was a heretic. You never demonstrated any of that. We never even talked about it. And they go, all right, but we got to find you guilty of something. They found him guilty of vehement suspicion of heresy. He was guilty of being suspected of being a heretic. And then when he gets up to denounce, he abjures anything and everything in my writing that is contrary to the church teaching, without ever saying what any of those things might be. In fact, the book that got him in trouble had already been passed by church censors. It was already approved by the church, and then a month later, the Pope suddenly discovered, shocked by the things that he had approved 2 months earlier. A Pope who was Galileo's good friend. So, you get the idea that the trial against Galileo was something odd. That it wasn't about science, it was about something that nobody actually talked about, but everybody kind of knew at the time. Whatever it was, it had nothing to do with heresy. The church was wrong to go out against him. But why did the church go against him? And that is where you come up with the grand discussions among historians. There are hundreds of books about Galileo, every one of them giving a different answer because nobody really knows. One phrase I've seen, it was a tragic conflict of world. How can worldviews be tragic? Why was it tragic? What would be tragic about it? Secretly he believed in atoms, which is of course in none of his writings, but that's how secret it was. The guy who actually came up with the atomic theory was Roger Boscovich, who was a Jesuit priest 100 years later and got no trouble with it. He made too many personal enemies. Of course he made personal enemies. He was an Italian. That's what we do. The philosophers were out to get him. The Jesuits were out to get him. One of the Jesuits said, you know, if he hadn't ticked us off in earlier on, we would have been nice and maybe he wouldn't have had this. Aha, you see, it's all your fault, he said. If only we had that much power. The two theories that basically are still up there is either it personally insulted the Pope, which maybe it did, or it was tied up in the politics of the 30 Years' War, which was the first major worldwide conflict in human history with battles in the Americas as well as among the different, and you really need a scorecard to keep track of who is on one side or another. The Spanish claimed to be fighting for the Catholics against those evil Protestants from the north, except the evil Protestants from the north were being supported by the French, who were very Catholic, and Galileo, who had come from the support of the Medici family, and the Medicis were being very careful to not be on either side. And the most crucial battles of the war occurred just at exactly the same time as Galileo's trial. But maybe it's a coincidence. If you want to know my view, it's in a chapter in this marvelous book. It's such a good book, you should all buy 2 copies. Where Paul Muller and I have a great debate over what was the reason why. And the point is not that he's right or that I'm right, but that it's a topic that you can debate forever. What it isn't is the church being anti-science. Because, here's the tough part, Galileo didn't have the goods. His proofs that the Copernican system was correct don't hold water. The observations he made of the planets can be explained by the Tycho Brahe system, where all the planets go around the sun, but the sun goes around the Earth. His proof that the Earth is spinning is that that's what gives us tides. It doesn't. He says that's why there's 1 tide a day, which is nice, except there's 2. He says, we'll see the Earth moving because as it moves from one side of the sun to the other in its orbit, 2 stars, one bright and one dim, therefore one close and one far away, will appear to shift, and one of these days we'll see it. He actually discovered that the middle star in the handle of the Big Dipper is exactly such a pair, a bright star and a dim star, and they don't move. Because it turns out they're actually a double star, one orbiting the other. And they just happen to be one brighter and one dimmer. But the fact that he didn't see what he expected, he handled in the good old-fashioned scientific way, he never published. His arguments were wrong. He was right. In the long run, we know the Copernican system was better than what came before. But they didn't have the goods. The best science of the day didn't support it. What's more, he required a telescope to see these things. And telescopes are very, very hard to use, long and narrow. Anybody who's an amateur astronomer knows you spend as much money on the tripod as you do on the telescope. He didn't have a tripod. There was a time when he was on his way from Florence back to Pisa, to collect his belongings and head down to take up a new job. And he had one of his telescopes with him, and he stops in Bologna. And the wise men of the town come out and they want to see this great telescope that he had just written a book about. And he tries to set up the telescope, and he has it dangling from a rope from a tree, and it's swinging around back and forth, and he can't find anything with it. And anybody who's done a telescope, tour with, you got your telescope set up and a long line of your neighbors want to look at it and you can't find, I know the Andromeda Galaxy is here someplace. Really, it's got to be. Somebody writes a really sarcastic book saying, this Galileo is a fraud. I tried looking through his telescope, couldn't find a thing. The other change that really confused the system was the difference between what counts as a proof. For philosophers, you start with an axiom, you work out logic, you come to a conclusion. And that was a demonstration. And Cardinal Bellarmine says, you haven't demonstrated that the Earth moves. So until you can demonstrate it, let's stick with the Aristotelian physics we know. Modern science, after Galileo, finally realized that we're not going to prove things. Science doesn't prove, it just describes. And our descriptions get ever better, but that means that the previous descriptions weren't so good, and they had to be fixed. That's why you don't use the same textbooks that I used when I was here 50 years ago. Science accepts that high probability is the way you choose one idea over another, depending on the empirical evidence, depending on how consistent it is with the background theories. But if you get new evidence, you might come up with a new background theory, then you'll change your explanation. In Galileo's day, probable meant, it must be true, it's in all of these books from the past. The mathematics of probability didn't even get started until Pascal and Fermat, 30 years after Galileo. You don't get statistics way into the future. So, was Galileo a hero or a villain? He hated those who copied his ideas, but in fact, most of the science that he did, he learned from people who are not nearly as famous and didn't write books, but you can find in their notebooks the things that Galileo made famous. He distrusted authority. He distrusted authority because he learned from his father and his teachers that you should always distrust authority. In other words, don't believe what you're taught is what he was taught. And that's why he didn't believe what he was. You can see the problem. He was furious at his friends when they were unfaithful, but, when he left Venice to go to Florence, he abandoned his friends. He abandoned the people who had done deals to get him a good job with the government. He abandoned his girlfriend and his 3 kids. He actually, stayed in touch with them as they became adults. The real thing that made Galileo brilliant was he had the vision of what the universe was, how it worked, what he was seeing, why it mattered. He realized that it wasn't enough that he knew, that he had to tell the world. If you don't publish, it didn't happen. And to tell the world meant writing in the vernacular. There are other great scientists, Gilbert comes to mind, who were Copernicans, but they wrote in Latin, and they made sure that the rest of the world, who weren't worthy of their ideas, that they wouldn't know. His children, especially Virginia, about whom the book Galileo's Daughter was written, thought he was wonderful. He made tremendous, strong friends. His students, many of whom were priests, cherished him deeply. He stayed faithful to his city, Florence. He stayed faithful to his church. When he could have fled, he could have gone to the Protestant north. He didn't. He stayed in Florence. He's a complicated guy. In many ways, he embodies all that's good and all that's bad in science. He was a wonderful predecessor to what science would become. Now, in the years that followed, Newton comes up with a set of laws. It's not until Newton's laws can explain the Keplerian version of the Copernican system that it's finally accepted. But Newton himself thought of himself as a theologian. If you look at who's doing science, publishing in the Philosophical Transactions, you find that it's a medical captain, or it's a nobleman, or it's a doctor, or it's the Reverend so-and-so. Science is done in the 1700s and in the 1800s by the people who've got the education and the free time to do science, many of whom are the reverend. What is science really to start with? It's collecting data and sorting data and organizing data. What do you call sorting and filing data? You call it clerical work. Why do they call it clerical? It was done by clerics. The same tasks that allow you to keep track of your parish so that you don't wind up two people who are cousins getting married also allows you to keep track of different types of leaves, different types of stars. It's not until this Whig idea catches hold in the 19th century with the technology that gives us steam engines and pollution, gives us electricity and light pollution. The technology which is so wonderful that I love it, and yet so problematic that I wince when I see it, doing bad things as well as good. By the end of the 19th century, and especially with the idea that science is going to replace religion, do we have the Pope finally establishing a Vatican observatory. And now we're going to rush through the next 100 years because I want to show you how the attitude of the Church, which went from Galileo being a wonderful scientist and scientists being clergymen, into this new Whig idea that the past was stupid and we can replace all of it with the knowledge of the future, and improve the human race through the marvelous science of eugenics. Don't even get me started on eugenics. Pope Leo XIII, in 1891, establishes a Vatican observatory for the sole purpose to show the world that the Church supports science. So to him, the lie is that the Church is obsolete because it doesn't embrace science. Not true. We do embrace science. We even support astronomers. To him, astronomy is a useful tool for the Church. A few popes later, you come up with Pius XI, who moves the Vatican Observatory out to the summer home in Castel Gandolfo, and in the dedication writes, "From no part of creation does there arise a more eloquent or stronger invitation to prayer and adoration." So in other words, astronomy is not just something that'll make the Church look good. It might, just might, inspire you to admire this Creator. And then, go in and use the prayers that the Church has for worshiping the Creator. The guy who comes after him, blanking in the word, Pius XII writes, "Man ascends to God by climbing the ladder of the universe." And now we've finally recovered something like Paul's letter to the Romans, where he says that since the beginning of time, God reveals himself in the things that were made. Astronomy might actually have a benefit in and of itself, not just as a way of leading people to become good Catholics. By the time we get to John Paul II, science can purify religion from error and superstition. Religion can purify science from idolatry and false absolutes. Yeah, that's me before my beard was gray. Suddenly, science and religion are on an equal basis, leading people to the truth. And in Pope Francis, speaking to our summer school of 25 astronomy students from around the world, scientific research can and should be a source of joy. In Psalm 8, the psalmist talks about the glory and honor that human race has been given. That glory and honor is the science of astronomy. Through us, this universe can become aware of itself, and it can become aware of its maker. That's the gift and that's the responsibility given to us as rational creatures. So we've gone from a science like astronomy being a useful PR gimmick to something that can stand next to a religion in leading us to the truth, that can do more but engage the human being who is doing the search for truth. And that's where we come to Laudato Si. Now, I do want to mention a couple of things about Laudato Si and climate change before we get into the theological side, just things that might be useful to remember. That's the building I worked in, both as a grad student, an undergrad, and a postdoc. There's Carl Sagan. Mentioned him before, pop scientist. He was actually a darn good scientist. And he was the one who pointed out the role of carbon dioxide in explaining the extremely high temperatures on Venus, things that we did not know until we sent a spacecraft there. So that part of science came out of the space age. And indeed, one of the great centers of climate change science came out of what used to be called Course 19, meteorology, and Ron Prinn, who I remember as a very young professor, who has put together a center on climate change. Climate change is not something invented by politicians 10 years ago. It was something we were talking about as students 50 years ago. But in fact, it's older than that. This is an article from the New York Times in 1956, which even uses the word greenhouse. Was first brought to the attention of scientists by Tyndall in 1861. Calculations indicate that if the carbon dioxide content of the Earth were doubled, the surface temperature would rise about 4 degrees C. 1956. There are actually articles about this in the Reader's Digest of the 1950s, that radical left-wing magazine. Who was this John Tyndall who came up with the idea? He was an Irishman, fiercely Protestant Irishman. He explained that the heat in the atmosphere in terms of absorption of infrared radiation, basically the idea behind climate change. He insisted on the primacy of reason and insisted that there had to be a barrier between science and religion, and certainly we can't let those Catholics run Ireland because they're a bunch of priest-ridden you-know-whats. Okay. One of the other principles that I can carry from my religion to my science is the principle that even if the priest is a terrible sinner, it doesn't make the Mass invalid. Even if the scientist is a racist SOB, their data might still be good. Even Galileo, who could abandon his kids, could nonetheless have deep insights into how the universe works. I don't know how many of you have read Laudato Si in English. It's a short book. It's an easy read. It's worth skimming through. But I'll give you 3 takeaways. First of all, it's not just about climate change. It's not just about ecology. The problems in our ecological system are symptoms of social problems and economic problems, and all of them ultimately are examples of sin. And you know, original sin's been around for a long time. It's not going away anytime soon. Likewise, the things that give us ecological problems aren't going to go away anytime soon. Though technology has given us the issues, technology isn't the simple fix. It's also very Jesuit. What do I mean by that? Pope Francis is a Jesuit. Jesuits have a certain style of spirituality. One of the key things in Jesuit spirituality is something in the exercises called the principle and foundation in the spiritual exercises. And these are the 4 points. We, human beings, are created to praise and reverence and serve God. The things of the world are there to help us. Therefore, we only use the things that can help us to this goal, and you don't care about the other things. You don't condemn them, you just say, not of interest. What you should desire isn't health or riches or honor or long life. Just help that which helps us to become what God created us to be. You know, if you ask a Jesuit to give them a soundbite of what Jesuit spirituality is, it's find God in all things. Notice how often things show up in this. It's one of the reasons why you find a lot of Jesuit scientists, because being a scientist is studying things. You find God in things. God created things. In the creation story of Genesis, we are told every step along the way, God makes the thing deliberately and then says, this is good. I recently had a Hebrew scholar, a scripture scholar, come and explain the word for good can also be translated in the right context as, that works. So, the fourth day, he's put together, the sun and the moon, and he steps back, he goes, yeah, that works. I think that's an attitude that everybody in this room can get into. That works. The solutions are to be found not in a simple fix-it, but in a new ethic, a new tech ethic. Economics should be more than just the invisible hand. If the only grade you have of are you winning or are you losing is how much money you have rather than how happy are you? How happy are more people? How satisfied are you with your life? Then your choices of what winning and losing looks like are going to be very different. Ecology is more than just save the whales. We shouldn't worship nature any more than we think we should dominate nature. I'll just end with one comment. If you don't find anything in this encyclical that bothers you, that says, oh, wait a minute, I want to argue with you, then you haven't read it carefully enough. I don't care what your politics is. I don't care what side of up, down, beyond, wherever. There will be things in here that will challenge you, and some places where you're going to say, yeah, but Pope Francis really does not like air conditioning. I live in Tucson. Wait a minute, Pope. Yeah, I know what you mean, but. Let me draw some lessons from this whole arc of seeing a different way of how the universe works, seeing how people were thinking of the universe as something to be observed, then something to be manipulated, then something to serve my goals already, into something that is good in and of itself. If science and faith are to work with each other, if there's to be a bridge between them, you can only build a bridge if they're basically each side is at the same level. I guess you could probably try to build a bridge that's downhill, but boy, that would be a miserable bridge. The stresses are beyond what I can imagine. We are creatures within this universe. When we're talking about ecology, we're also talking about ourselves. When we're talking about things, we are also talking about ourselves. We are subject to the laws of nature, just as we are subject to God's laws. Science is done by human beings. And no matter who you are, you're going to be brilliant and you're going to be full of sin. You're going to be tempted, and sometimes you won't even see the temptations. Things are not going to be perfect. But as scientists, we should be ready for that because that's how we progress. A science book that hasn't changed in 50 years is a book about a topic where we haven't learned anything new. Newtonian physics is dead because you could use a Halliday and Resnick that I used 50 years ago and learn the same physics because nobody's invented anything new in Newtonian physics. But you sure better not be using the same quantum book that I used or the same planetary science book I used. Because in science, failure is not an option, it's a requirement. We only learn by recognizing that we were wrong and admitting that we were wrong and being thankful that we were wrong because then we realized we're about to learn something new and I'm going to get a paper out of it. Ultimately, our problems are not technical problems with technical solutions. They're human problems of good and evil. We have to not only get rid of the idea that the past was perfect and we're all a bunch of worthless creatures by comparison, we also have to get rid of the idea that science in and of itself is going to replace the need to understand good and evil. And T.S. Eliot has a marvelous line in one of the choruses of his play, The Rock, talking about the modern human being of 1935. Hasn't changed a whole lot. They constantly try to escape from the darkness outside and within by dreaming of systems so perfect that no one will need to be good. The invisible hand of the economy. Oh, socialism. Oh, communism. Oh, my brand of Catholicism. If only everybody agreed with me, then no one would need to be good. But the man that is shall shadow the man that pretends to be. If you think your system is perfect, then you can never admit that you're wrong. And if you can never admit that you're wrong, you'll never grow and you'll never learn. And you'll never get any better. The Golden Age mentality, it reminds us that technology alone doesn't bring a golden age in the future, and that faith and reason, past and present and future, must be seen as equals. The role of instruments in discovery, technology, is the extension of the human. That's why it's so wonderful. That's why I love being a part of an institute dedicated to technology. But because it's an extension of the human, it can be used for good or ill, unintentionally. There was, I'm blanking on the name, a chemist in the 20th century who made the 20th century possible with two phenomenally important chemical inventions. The first was an additive to automobile fuel, to gasoline, so that cars could be powerful enough to go up hills and to go at great speeds without the engine knocking. He was the idea of adding just a tiny bit of lead into the fuel. And he was the guy who made refrigerators safe to have in your home, because rather than using ammonia and other gases, he invented chlorofluorocarbons. Okay, so now we know that both of these have unintended bad consequences. But we wouldn't be where we are without them. Technology will always have unintended bad consequences that we are always going to have to keep working on, which means we're always going to need new graduates from MIT. This is not a bad thing. Because we're human. And at the end of the day, for all of our sinfulness, we're redeemed humans. And with a little bit of work, the good we do will overcome the bad. Reason, involved in the standard of proof, lives within a human matrix. Reason is essential to what it is to be a human being. It's not the only thing. We are creatures of passion. We are creatures of love. We are creatures who can determine which theory we're going to write a thesis about on the basis of what feels like the right answer, what seems to be the more elegant solution, what is the one that just seems like it's more fun to work on. And yet we are also creatures of reason. What do we know about God and creation? From the opening of John's Gospel, in arche heto logos is the Greek. I learned that in high school before I was going to be a nerd. I was a Greek nerd. In the beginning was the Word. The word for word is logos, but the word for word, logos, is also the root word for logic. In the beginning was logic, and logic was with God, and logic was God. The second person of the Trinity is reason, is word. What a powerful endorsement of the intellectual life. But this reason lives in a human matrix where it can be fooled, where it can be misled, where it can do perfectly reasonable things that get you the right answer. When I was a sophomore here 50 years ago, I had 3 courses in a row on Tuesdays and Thursdays. The first was the mathematical methods, where they taught us absolutely never do this, this, or this, because it's mathematically invalid. And then the second was 803, where we did half of those things you were never supposed to do. And the other was 560, where we did the other half of the things you were never supposed to do, because it worked. Reason lives within a human matrix. And so I end with a very human way of thinking about the universe that I think is coherent with everything we set up to now. And this is from G.K. Chesterton, writing in 1909. The essence of all pantheism was that nature was our mother, but the main point of Christianity is this: nature is not our mother, nature is our sister. Got the same father. Nature was a solemn mother to the worshippers of Isis and Cybele, to Wordsworth or to Emerson, but to St. Francis, nature is a sister and even a younger sister, a little dancing sister to be laughed at as well as loved. You're not afraid of your little sister, and you're not someone who will dominate your little sister. You love your little sister. We love nature because we are siblings, because we are creatures, things made by a God who made things and said, yep, that works. Thank you very much.